Well, okay. Well, I tried going live a little while ago, and apparently it cut out. Um, hopefully, this works, and hopefully, I can do this quicker after doing a rough draft the last video. Okay, so tomorrow, Shane Starr and I are going to do another joint live video, and we want to talk about polar testing and different types of tests that may or may not work in trying to figure out what somebody's polar function is. And so before doing that, I just wanted to do sort of a pre-video to sort of lay out some of the definitions, terms, the way I think about the structure, um, because I know it's going to be different than maybe some of the viewers might think of it as, um, especially if it sort of depends on where you're learning all this stuff from. So we are going to be talking about polar functions, which I do understand is sort of taken from the socionics structure. But I'm the first to admit that the way that I look at things isn't necessarily the way that socionics does. And a lot of that is my fault, maybe, and not theirs. Just because I don't know all of it, I don't understand all of it. And to me, it's a very TI system with a lot of slicing and dicing and, different, in a month with an R in it, this is what this means. In a month without an R, it means this. A lot of these weird TI rules that, quite frankly, we, judgers just have a hard time dealing with because, which I'll sort of explain in a minute here. We're looking for more sort of practical, how does this work kind of solutions rather than the deep dive into all the technicalities of the definitions and the 48 things that each type has and all that. So full disclosure, yeah, we're going to be borrowing these terms from socionics, but with the full understanding that maybe it's not exactly the way socionics thinks of it. Okay, but I do base my framework or my model or the way that I think about it off of Eric's model over talking with famous people, and what he has coined as the defensible typology method or structure, and it uses the MBTI terminology, right? Thinking, feeling, sensing, intuition, but maybe in a very different way than you might be used to, especially if socionics or MBTI or objective personality theory or whatever that is, they might explain these functions in very, very different ways. I mean, I think the way that I think of it sort of encapsulates all the different ways, but I guess you could be the judge. Okay, so, and it's also not to say that, my take or the way that I explain things is necessarily the way that Eric would explain it or how he necessarily thinks about it. So I don't want to, act like, I'm speaking on, behalf of him. I think in general, we sort of see things the same way. We might describe them a little differently, but we'd probably agree we're getting at basically the same thing. Okay, so here it is. So when thinking of cognitive functions, even though I'm going to use the same terminology, I want you to think of them in more computational terms, okay? Where your brain or your mind, however you want to think about it, has different types of computations or problems, computational problems it has to solve, okay? Or it has to compute or interact with. And the four things are: you need a knowledge function, you need an interfacing function, you need what a deliberation function, and I'll explain what all these are in a second. And then you need what Eric refers to as an action function. I think of it as more of an information gathering and sharing function, but I think action might cover it as well. Action functions are the hardest, at least for me, to kind of explain what's going on. But we'll get there. Okay. So any sort of computational process is going to need those four things. Okay. But the way that MBTI has sort of structured everything, and I think it works by and large, is you've got your J's and you've got your P's. Okay. My first division when I'm sort of typing people is this person a J or a P? Because the J's, INFJ, ISTJ, ESTJ, ESFJ, all of the J, anything that ends with a J, their first two functions are going to be a knowledge function and an interface function, right? The interface function might be number one, with the knowledge function being number two. Those are your EJs. Or you might have a knowledge function as number one and an interface function at number two. Those are your IJs. Okay. But they're Js. And Js like interfacing with the world. And interfacing is long-term goal-oriented behavior. Projects. We're projects people. We like projects. We wake up every day and think of every day as just a series of projects that we're working on. Okay. Now, the type of project and the way we frame the project and the way we attack the project might be different, but by and large, we're project people. We're 9-to-5ers, right? We're the types of people you could put in an office, give us a task, we'll figure it out, we'll do it, and we're pretty reliable. We're, the conscientious types, the industrious types, the, lack of a better term, project people. Okay. And that is because one of the function that we have where we're dealing with the outside world, our extroverted function, is either extroverted thinking or extroverted feeling. Okay. And those are your interface functions. Those are your functions where you're engaging in long-term planning. You're trying to get from point A to point Z. Okay. And you have to figure out generally the steps along the way. Now, extroverted thinking is much more mechanical, linear. It sees the world as a very mechanical, physical type of way, where things tend to work in a consistent manner, right? So it's very machine oriented, or maybe even numbers oriented, process oriented in the sense of like business processes. And so the TE is going to be figuring out how to operate machinery, in sort of but in more of a long-term, systematic way, not just, which button do I press, but, how is this going to work? How do I piece these different things together to accomplish my goal, in a long-term project-oriented kind of way. Okay. But to do that, you have to have a knowledge function, which is basically, what you know about the world, right? And that's going to be either NI or SI, where SI is basically built off of your experience with the world. So your knowledge base is based off of either your direct experience or somebody told you, here's how things work, but it's very, here are the rules. Here's how things work. And here's what I've learned along the way, that works, right? Experience-driven knowledge, where NI is knowledge about the world, but not based off of experience, but based off of what I think of as analogy, or building, relationships or associations between the meaning of things in your knowledge base, to where you're looking at sort of the underlying meaning and how things are interconnected on a meaning basis. Okay. Where SI, yeah, it might understand the meaning, but a lot of it is because that's just, somebody explained it to him that way, or that's, based off of their experience. These are, this type of person tends to act this way because every time I interact with this type of person, here's how they act. Or I've been told, that this is how these types of people, behave in different contexts, et cetera, et cetera. But it's based off of their, personal experience that they built this knowledge off of. Where NI is a little bit more like we're kind of figuring it out on our own, right? We're kind of figuring out, if you sort of put two and two together or read between the lines, here's what's going on with this type of person. Okay. And even though I might not have ever had experience with them, I sort of get it, at this intuitive level, right? Okay, so there's plenty to say about that. There's plenty of ways to unpack it, but the point is that you need a knowledge function and an interface function. Interface TE, sorry, going back to TE and FE, I realized I skipped over FE. So TE is going to be more mechanical, linear, ordinal steps, where FE is a little bit, FE is dealing with people. FE is about, trying to get people to do what you want. So it's goal-oriented behavior, but more in a social way. Okay. And the way that, and so because people are not machines and they tend to act differently, the same person can act differently on a different day, based off of their mood or the context or whatever. And so you have to be, when you're engaging with FE type of stuff and you're trying to get people to do things, or you're trying to engage with people, you have to be a little bit more flexible. You can't think of them as mechanical machines. And so I think of FE as sort of nonlinear in that respect. And it's dealing way more with feedback loops, right? So it's sort of reading the person, seeing how they react to what you said, reading them, hearing what they have to say, and then reacting to them, and sort of adjusting maybe a little bit more on the fly, a little bit more nonlinear, because, you have two different brain systems that are processing goal-oriented behavior, and so is this goal something more mechanical, where the world is pretty much the same every time you do it, or the machine is the same, or the process is the same every time you do it, and you could do a little tinkering here and there, but you can sort of expect, how it's going to react, as opposed to FE, where you really don't know if it's going to, you have a general sense of how people are going to react, but you have to be ready to sort of readjust on the fly. Okay, and be a little bit more flexible. So you have those two interfacing functions: dealing with people, dealing with things, and processes, stuff like that. And then what knowledge base you're using, right? Because if you're going to do long-term goal-oriented behavior, you want it to be based off of some sort of knowledge that you have about the world. How do things work, or how do people work? So an INFJ is going to be, their sweet spot is going to be interfacing with people, some sort of relationship, social type of, project or plan. But relying on sort of their intuitive knowledge about people, maybe not necessarily based off of their direct experience, but their sort of intuition about how people work. Where an ISFJ is also going to be, their sweet spot is going to be engaging in some sort of social goal-oriented behavior, but they're going to rely much more on their experience, that, or tried and trusted rules, things that work. And, rather than sort of putting their own sort of spin on it or reading between the lines, they're definitely going to rely more on, what their experience tells them about how people work, that kind of stuff. So we can talk about, specific examples, but that's the general framework. Okay. So now your EJs, they're sort of different. So, well, let me step back. So your IJs, their polar function is going to be the interfacing function that they're not used to, right? So for INFJ and ISFJ, TE is going to be our polar function. Okay, so if somebody comes to us and says, tell me how to build a hot air balloon, or tell me how this microwave works, or tell me, design a computer for me, or a motherboard, or whatever for a computer, design a new TV, or something like that. We feel outside of our comfort zone because we tend to think of machines like people, right? Right. And we don't really know how machines work. We don't have that kind of knowledge. Now, with an INFJ, we're going to think of it more like, I don't understand how microwaves work. I don't understand how TVs work. I don't get how, the electricity and all that kind of stuff sort of flows through and makes everything happen. I just don't get it, right? That's not like, I don't have an intuitive sense of it like an INTJ might, right? An INTJ might just have this intuitive sense of the way that things work that aren't people. Where the INFJ is more like, hey, I get people, I understand how people work, but I don't understand all this mechanical stuff, right? So don't ask me to fix your engine. Don't ask me to change your oil. Don't ask me to figure out how this microwave works, that kind of stuff, right? The ISFJ, they're also going to have an issue dealing with a TE interface, long-term planning kind of thing. But their hesitation is more about, I just don't have experience with this. Like, I've never seen a TV like this, or I've never had to work on a car before. I've never had to change a tire. I've never had to figure out a microwave or whatever. I just don't have the experience. But, maybe with a little bit of experience, I could figure it out, right? We hope. Okay. And so that's, that's the polar function and deliberation. INTJs, ISTJs, again, they're sorry, I said deliberation, I meant interface. Their interface function is going to be TE. So they get how things work. They get how processes work. But they don't get how people work necessarily, right? Now, they might have some information, they acquired some knowledge along the way, just like INFJs have acquired some knowledge about how to operate machines along the way, but it's not, robust in the way it might be in another type. Okay. So, so when you're doing a polar test with somebody who you think is an IJ, you're going to sort of hone in on that interfacing function, right? Do they feel comfortable with an FE interface? But then as soon as you try to make them, operate on a TE interface task or question, do they kind of fall off a cliff? And the classic example with the INFJs and the ISFJs is you give them a TE question, and the first thing they think of is, well, I'm going to find somebody to help me, to accomplish that, to do that TE task. Why? Because it's way easier for us to convince somebody to help us do it than to figure it out ourselves, right? Where, an INTJ or an ISTJ, if you give them an FE interfacing task, like, imagine you owe your best friend $100, but you don't have it and you can't pay them. How do you deal with that situation, right? An ISTJ and INTJ, it's not going to come as easy to them. They're probably going to think of a solution of like, well, how do I get the $100, right? But that's not the question. The question is, how do you convince your friend, to kind of still be your friend, even though you don't have the $100 that you owe them, right? So that's the interfacing function, and that's basically what the polar testing is trying to do, is tease apart, are you okay in one interfacing domain, but not so good in the other interfacing domain? There might be something there, okay? So for our other J's, the EJs, their polar function is going to be in the knowledge domain, right? So instead of teasing apart their ability to do the interfacing, either FE or TE, really what you want to tease apart is what knowledge can they rely on? And you have to find a task where either they have to rely on their SI, and if they're an ENFJ or an ENTJ, they're going to be SI polar. And if they have a hard time just giving you SI information, chances are they're polar, right? And we'll talk about different methods that sort of crack into that. And then same thing with ESFJs and ESTJs, they're going to be NI polar, and you're going to be sort of pushing them to see if they can give you NI type of information, as opposed to just SI information. And so they tend, if they're polar and NI, they tend to sort of, if they're presented with a situation where they have no experience with it and they've never had to deal with it before, they tend to just jump into all the what ifs, the what if, rather than sort of looking at, okay, here's how it's probably going to happen, right? Here's how things are probably going to unfold based off of NI type of knowledge about the world. Like, the world just works this way. And even though you've never had to deal with this, situation before, you don't have experience dealing with the situation, you should be able to tap into your NI and just sort of understand, here's how it's probably going to unfold. Here's how the world basically works, on a meaning level, on an association level. And they have difficulty with that, and trusting somebody who tells them, hey, trust me, you're going to be fine. Here's how things are going to unfold. They don't want to hear that. They want to hear, I want an expert who's done this a million times to tell me exactly what's going to happen. Those are ESFJs, ESTJs. Okay. So with the Js, again, we're process people. We like to interface with the world on sort of project-oriented tasks, okay? Long-term things, sequential, trying to get from point A to point Z out there, okay? Those are the Js. The Ps, on the other hand, their lead function, or their either lead function or second function, is going to be it's going to be one of two deliberation functions. So TI or FI, right? So they're going to have either TI first or FI first, or TI second or FI second, right? They're deliberators. They like to think of conclusion. Deliberation is all about coming up with a conclusion. Is something valid? Is something true? Is something logical? Is something illogical? Is something untrue? Is something quote unquote irrational? Is something fair? Is something not fair? Is something likable? Is something valuable? Is something not valuable? They're constantly sort of living in that deliberation world. And and I like to think of them as the here and now people, right? They're not the type of people that you want to put in an office and just say, okay, do a million tasks for me, right? They're the types of people that, you have a very specific question. Is something valid? Is something true? Is something fair? Is something not fair? And give me an answer. And I want you to think through it and, come up with an answer. And that deliberation function is going to be paired with, again, what Eric refers to as an action function. I think of it as more of an information gathering and sharing function. And it's basically the sandbox that you like to play in. Okay. So if you're an SP, ISTP, ISFP, ESFP, ESTP, you like playing in the physical world, the sandbox of the physical world. Okay. And whatever your five senses tell you is out there in reality in the physical world. Okay. Where the NE, extroverted intuition users, they want to deal in the metaphysical world. They want to deal in the world of ideas and abstract concepts. Okay. That's their play space. That's their little sandlot. And when they're deliberating, they're going to deliberate about, if they're an ENTP or an INTP and they've got extroverted intuition, they're going to deliberate about concepts, about ideas. They like to debate. They like to, and it's stuff in the here and now. Like, let's explore the any space together right now. Right. They're going to jump on the comments, right? Like all the INTPs and ENTPs that want to comment on all the videos, they want to correct you and let you know, okay, well, you said this, but you didn't really mean that. And, you're defining this term this way, but I don't really think that's the right definition. I think, you should, think of it more this way, and they're constantly getting hung up on definitions and the logical order of things and whether something is valid or invalid. And so those are your introverted thinkers. The introverted feelers are going to be more concerned about whether something's fair, whether something's valuable, whether it's, makes sense from an ethical perspective. We've got this tax bill that we want to pass. Is it fair to everybody? Yeah, from a TI perspective, it might make us a lot of money, or the government a lot of money, or it might save our donors a lot of money, however you want to think about it. But, the FI people swoop in and say, well, is it fair? Is it fair to everybody? They're going to, rely much more on those sorts of arguments. But again, they're dealing in the here and now. But with abstract concepts like tax law and, economic fairness, things like that. Your ISTPs, ISFPs, ESFPs, ESTPs, they're not so much concerned about dealing in the metaphysical, abstract idea sandbox. They're much more about the here and now physical sandbox. Am I winning for an ESTP? Am I making the most money that I possibly can? That kind of stuff. ISTPs and ISFPs, they're more about, the ISTP, I think of it as like the mechanic or the surgeon that, they got to fix something and they got to fix it right now. Right. Think of a surgeon and, all of a sudden, open heart surgery and the patient starts bleeding out on the table. If you're an INFJ, you're just putting up your hands and walking out of the room like, it wasn't me, it wasn't my fault. But the ISTPs, like, they get it. They get the mechanics. They understand like why this person's bleeding out and why, how the different veins and arteries in the heart and all that stuff work. ISFPs, obviously they're the more artsy type, because they can make, if you're an ISFP painter, you're constantly making decisions about, okay, is this the right color? Is this the right brushstroke? Is just all these little decisions that have to be made to make a painting or to design a room. Is this the right fabric? Is this the right type of, structure of couch? Is the couch in the right place? Should it be here? Should it be there? I mean, as an INFJ, I watched that and I'm just like, how do you, I bet my daughter's an ISFP and she's very into that kind of stuff and jewelry design. And I'm just like, how do you decide like, which metal to use with which stone or which colors to use together and all that kind of stuff. And it just comes naturally to them. They just understand like this looks cool. They've got a good aesthetic and they can make those decisions on the fly. they're not very big long-term planners, right? And so, you know, putting them in sort of a 9 to 5 office job is probably like, you know, almost, a jail sentence in a lot of ways. Now, you do have some P's, some perceiver types in office jobs, but they tend to flock to being experts in sort of a niche area. So you can go to them and ask them, okay, I want to do X, Y, and Z. Does that work under this law or under this accounting principle or whatever? And they will engage in the TI and do their little voodoo TI magic and figure out, in a deliberative way, yes, that works, or no, that doesn't work, and here's why. You might also see some perceivers more in sort of like, if they're lawyers, it might be more like trial lawyers where they have to deal with, thinking on the fly, dealing with the judge, dealing with the jury, that kind of stuff on the fly and the here and now, as opposed to, long-term planning. Your big corporate litigators where you have civil cases that will last for almost, sometimes decades and years. They're going to be the long-term planners. They're going to be the J's. But your average sort of, day-to-day trial lawyer doing DUI cases or, that kind of stuff where you're constantly in front of a jury, probably more likely a perceiver that can work in the here and now. Okay, so when we're talking about polar functions with the perceivers, again, we're going to be tapping into, either a deliberative process or what I call the sandbox process. Like, how comfortable are you interacting in the NE world, right? So, for example, ISFPs and ISTPs, like you almost know immediately on a testing session whether somebody's an ISFP or an ISTP because they barely talk, right? They don't like really engaging in that any back and forth banter that Eric does because he's an ENTP. So there's a lot of back and forth banter with him, or at least he's trying to push that. And the ISFJs will just kind of, they'll laugh along, be polite. Yeah. Or sorry, not the ISFJs, the ISFPs. Sorry, it's getting late here. They're NE polar, and so they just don't like the back and forth banter. Where as opposed to maybe an INFP, so they've got the NE, so they could do that back and forth banter. They like to talk about ideas and stuff, but they don't like to play in the real world sandbox. Like they're the world's procrastinators, INFPs, INTPs. They're the world's procrastinators because the dealing with the physical world and interacting with the physical world sandbox is just kind of just not their thing, right? And so they're kind of the classic absent-minded professor, right? Where, brilliant, thinkers and know a lot about, a given area or a given topic, because they've just drilled it down so hard with their TI. But then when it comes time to like write a book chapter or write a paper, that could be publishing their data and getting it out there, it's like pulling teeth with, them a lot of times, because, they're never done. They're never done, deliberating, because it's a constant process. Okay. So that in a nutshell is sort of the framework and the way that I think about, polar testing. And another thing I want to mention, of course, only cis deal in absolutes, right? So you might hear me or Shane or somebody talking about, if you're polar, you can't do this, or if you're polar, and it's not to say that they can't do it. It's just it takes a lot of attention to do it, in that domain, and they'd rather do it in a different domain. They'd rather solve the TE problem using an FI or FE solution, right? Or they'd rather solve the NI problem using an SI solution. You know, can I figure out, you know, what's true about the world just based off of what people have told me or what I've experienced, you know, that kind of thing. Okay. And so, but when, you know, but when we say things like, you know, they can't do it, it's more like, I like to think of it as, you know, right hand versus left hand. You know, we've got a dominant hand that we tend to use for most things. And every once in a while, we have to use our non-dominant hand, like we're playing a musical instrument or we're operating some sort of machinery or doing something. And we have to use our left hand when we're right-handed. And we could do it. We just would prefer to use our right hand if we can, right? And especially if we're asked to do something new that we've never done before, we're more likely to try to use our right hand than our left hand, right? But it doesn't mean that we can't do it, right? It's more just like static on the system, okay? So when I say things like, oh, that person's polar, so they can't do TI, you know, I'm usually sort of over exaggerating for effect, right? And it's sort of like drawing out a cartoonish caricature of somebody where you're exaggerating things just to sort of make the point, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're just absolutely devoid of that function and can't do it at all. But you know, they might fall off a cliff and have a hard time with it when presented. But eventually, you know, if they put enough attention into it, they could probably figure it out. Another thing is, you know, why do the polar testing? And this is more of a sort of entomological or philosophical sort of argument where, you know, it's really the only testing method. And of course, comes from talking with famous people's testing sessions where where it aligns with the general principles of the scientific method, right? Where your goal in the scientific method is to try to find something to come up with a preposition that is falsifiable and then try to falsify it through some sort of experiment, right? And so here what we're doing is we're sort of starting off, or Eric does a typing session, is sort of starting off with a clean slate and assuming that everybody, you know, that this person that he's interacting with can do any of the functions, right? But then if he stumbles across a function where the person is having, you know, legitimate problems doing it, then, you know, that's a pretty good sign that it's probably polar, and he can sort of push on it and see, you know, okay, is that something that's missing here? And then once you find the polar function, then everything else sort of starts falling into place because you're going to be one of two types. And then it's just sort of a matter of figuring out, you know, are you sort of a J type or a P type? And, you know, where's if your polar function is an interfacing function like TE or something, then are you an SI user or an NI user, you know, on your front stack? And you can sort of start through process of elimination, figure out what somebody is. And that's a lot different, right, than just me watching a couple of videos of Joe Rogan or Bill Gates or Lady Gaga or whatever, and just saying, yeah, you know, they seem to be ENTP to me, you know, because they're just acting all ENTP like. Well, what does that mean? You know, I mean, how did you, where's the analysis there? How did you come to that conclusion? Well, you know how ENTPs are. That's an ENTP. They tend to do this, and that person's doing this. And to me, that's not very convincing, right? I mean, that's not really the scientific method. And there might be some people who are really good at it and are really good at, you know, reading people and knowing right away, and they're probably an INFJ if they are, you know, knowing right away what type of person somebody is or personality somebody is. But, you know, but it's still open to debate, right? When you do the polar function, you know, I mean, obviously everything's still open to debate. Nothing's perfect. but you're a lot closer to a convincing, somewhat scientifically sound argument, right? That you're correct. Okay. So I've got a lot of videos on that, and why I think polar testing is sort of the bee's knees when it comes to this stuff. And hopefully tomorrow we'll elaborate on it a little bit more, and hopefully if we raise definitions or terms or structures, you can come back to this video and maybe it helps explain it a little. But if not, I'm happy to make more videos and over explain it if I need to. So with that being said, it looks like I do have some comments. Let me see. TE and linearity, interesting. Seeing TE with SI would be even more so. Yeah, I would agree. So TE and SI are probably going to be pretty linear. Your ISTJs, your ESTJs. They've got a process and they're going to stick with it, right? And it's going to be pretty linear and not too flexible, especially if it works, right? And so, the breakdown you see is when the thing that worked for the last 50 years no longer works because they changed the law, the tax law, and so now you can't do it anymore, or something like that. Then they have to sort of regroup and figure out a new process. But yeah, I mean, I would agree that that combination is particularly linear, and then you might compare them with an ENTJ and an INTJ, where it's probably because they're using intuition as their knowledge base. It's going to be a little more flexible, a little bit more fluid, a little bit more subjective, shall we say? Where they're sort of coming up with how they think the world works based off of their pattern recognition and ability to make associations among concepts. And so that might be a little bit more flexible, because I think people who use NI, just sort of my observation or the way that I think about it, I think they're more willing to admit that they're wrong about something because they're not digging their heels in on, oh, well, so-and-so told me that this is the rule, or this is the way that we've always done it, so we have to do it this way. If you're using NI, you might throw some stuff against the wall and see what sticks a little bit more. Now, you're not totally in any world where you're just looking at all the different possibilities, but you're sort of looking within a limited, range, which is probably a little bit more expansive than your SI user is going to use. Looking forward to the discussion. As an SI polar, it's very difficult to provide detailed information about my experience. Okay, yeah, and that's certainly what Eric is, will typically test for. I think it's usually kind of the first thing he tests for. It certainly was with me, of how detailed is your SI, or how robust is your SI, because it's pretty easy to tell. A lot of ENTJs who get typed, he'll ask, hey, what did you do the last time you went to the grocery store? Walk me through that experience. Like, what did you buy? What was the order? That kind of thing. And they'll just say, well, I just went and got, the usual. Okay, but what did you get? Well, the usual, groceries. I was at the grocery store, so I got the groceries that I always get. And they just have or you ask them about their vacation. Tell me your favorite, moment during your vacation. Oh, I just like the fact that I could just, get away from the office for a couple of weeks. Okay, but what did you do specifically on your vacation that you enjoyed? Well, just hanging out with friends and family. That's always a good time. Like they just cannot give you that SI specifics. Bipolar, subjectively, it's more fun to talk about people's problems than anything else about them. Okay, yeah, I guess that's true. So another reason to tap into the polar is know thyself, right? I mean, I think the just from personal experience, after being going through one of Eric's testing sessions, and when I went through the testing session, like I did not think INFJ at all. Like it hadn't occurred to me at all. Um, and coming out as INFJ and then realizing like, okay, yeah, this TE polar thing is a real thing, and then starting to see it pop up here and there. Now you never want to use it as an excuse or a crutch or anything like that, but it does help you sort of realize like, okay, you know, here are some situations you want to avoid getting yourself into. Um, as opposed to, thinking that you get this TE thing down. Um, like don't go opening up your computer and trying to install new memory cards or fix whatever problem. Like go to somebody who knows what they're doing. That kind of stuff certainly helps. And then also just dealing with other people. If you're able to sort of hone in on what you think their polar is, like okay, this is not the person I want to give this type of task to, right? This is not the person I want to go in and convince John in accounting, to take a pay cut, right? They don't have the sort of effy suaveness to make that happen. Things like that. Okay, more seriously, if the goal of typology is to help us, then stands to reason that we should focus on what we need to improve. Okay, so this gets me into another sort of quasi issue I have with typology in general, of whether, how is it helpful? And there are a lot of people out there who make the argument that, when if you know you're an INFJ, then you know that SE is sort of an inferior function, and let's go build up that inferior function and work those SE muscles and make you a more well-developed person. And even worse are the people who say, okay, you got all these shadow functions, and they like to take this Carl Jung approach of, you have to face your demons and you have to face your shadow, or otherwise you're just going to be dragged along by your unconscious and doing all kinds of crazy shit that you shouldn't be doing. But if you face your shadow functions or you face your demons, then you'll be a more individualized type of person. And that was a very Carl Jung type of approach, but I don't really buy into it. Carl Jung is very smart, and I like a lot of his ideas, but I don't like wasting time on things that are probably never going to help. Right? Like I think if you're TE polar, you're TE polar, right? And no matter how much you want to exercise your TE muscles and how many computers you're going to open up and try to fix, or microwaves or car engines, you're really just kind of wasting your time. Yeah, rather people spend their time more efficiently and more productively and focus on what they're good at, right? And if you're TE polar, just accept the fact that you're just going to have to pay somebody to fix shit for you, right? Or to change your oil or whatever, and then move on with your life, right? I mean, to me, it makes it so much easier rather than trying to flex muscles where it's just kind of pointless, in my mind. Maybe I'm being too, pessimistic, but I've been around long enough and seen enough people trying to go through all this self-help guru stuff. And I think it does more harm than good, because really they're sort of wasting their time focusing on things that they're not good at, when they should be focusing on things that they are good at. And like in economics, what's the concept? Where if you're really good at making wine, but you're really shitty at making cars, you should focus your economy on making wine, as opposed to making cars. Let the Germans make the cars and let the French make the wine, right? Somebody can remind me, there's a term in economics about comparative advantage. Yeah, comparative advantage. Focus on your comparative advantage, and you'll be way more productive, and probably way happier than focusing on shit that it doesn't really matter if you're everybody's polar on something, right? And and nobody's going to be perfectly perfect all the time. And if we all were firing on all 8 cylinders, where every function was at its maximum capacity, that would be a pretty boring world, right? There really wouldn't be any real personalities out there. I like the fact that that everybody has some sort of weakness that you can poke and prod. But I also like the fact that people have their own little superpowers too. Okay. There are the self-help gurus who believe that you should focus on your weaknesses so you can become closer to perfection. Yeah. It's a difference in philosophy. Astrology helped me understand that. Yeah, I mean, I certainly think it's a difference in philosophy, but I think it's just kind of, I don't know. Like I said, I mean, Carl Jung, that's what he was all about. And I get it. I mean, his whole thing was, if you don't face your demons and you don't face these unconscious processes, then they're just going to drag you through life and, make your life miserable. Unless you sort of stare them down and get them to back off or whatever. And I just don't see that. I mean, I see people who burn out, and I've been around in different, I've been in academia, I've been in law school, I've been a lawyer, worked in different types of industries. And so I have a somewhat unique perspective on, seeing people develop and seeing people grow and mature. And in my opinion, it's the people who find their sweet spot, who find something that they're good at and that they enjoy doing, and they don't feel like they're in like the 7th level of hell doing it, that really do well and flourish. And it's the people who are put in a position where they have to do like a polar function constantly, that are miserable and burn out, and and I don't see forcing them to just keep doing it is beneficial to anybody. I just don't. Now, I do think that as you get older, you tend to develop, your 3rd and 4th function, I think, a little bit more, but that's just kind of through experience and just being forced to use it a little bit more. But but I don't think it's like, I don't think there's like a program or something that spend 20 minutes a day working on your TE to become the perfect person. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Okay. Excellent points, which underscore why knowing our polar function can be helpful. Yeah, I mean, again, know thyself, right? Rather than trying to convince yourself that you're good at everything. Instead, know your strengths, know your weaknesses. It's the serenity prayer, right? Give me the strength. Yeah, what is it? Give me, give me the strength to change what is it? But basically, like, give me the courage to change what I can, and the, the serenity to accept what I can't change, and the wisdom to know the difference, right? So the serenity prayer goes a long way. That's a good philosophy, rather than the unserenity prayer, which would be, give me the courage to change all the things that I can't change. I mean, what's the fun in that? Anyways, okay. Capricorn energy is all about doing what is practical compared to achieving ideals. Okay, that's in line with what I usually hear about Capricorns. It has been fun to see how MBTI types match the esoteric side of things. Even though some would say the MBTI is very esoteric. Yeah, it is. I mean, it's not perfect, but I think it gets bagged on too much by all the little, socionic bros, who are very TI heavy and, again, in constant deliberation mode where they can't accept, anything is being valid without, nitpicking it even more and, trying to slice it, dice it even more, to where you have like these 48 things that every type is supposed to have. And if you know anything about statistics and Bayes' theorem and stuff like that, you can't have a classification system where you have to, match 40 different criteria. It's, if you have 1% or less than 1%, error in measurement, it basically makes everything unravel. And so I get it. I get it's fun to make these arguments and to do the slicing and the dicing and that deep dive TI stuff. But from a real practical standpoint, it makes no sense. Right? I like the MBTI because it's simple and it's easy to apply. And even DISC is even simpler and even more easy to apply, because it doesn't rely on so many classification schemes that, if you have a 1% chance of error, the entire thing falls apart, right? Just throw it into ChatGPT and tell it to do a Bayes theorem analysis on it, and you'll see that like you have like a 1% chance of being correct on anything. So, the more you slice and dice, the harder it is to have a system that, withstands sort of statistical scrutiny. So that's why most people in academia, they like the simple either 4 or 5, variables. And even that's pushing it. 4 or 5 variables is kind of pushing it quite a bit. But I'll let the statistics people jump in and have that argument. Okay, this type is very argumentative about their own type. Let's see here. It's funny how a system proves their type is behaving as intended. This type is very argumentative about their type. Yeah. Like, I mean, the INTPs refuse to believe anything because they're INTPs. And so when you tell, when you sort of raise just the idea of MBTI and personality types with them, they latch on because it's interesting, right? And there's a puzzle to be solved, and there's a problem to be solved, and a TI thing to, a thing to tickle their TI-ness. But they refuse to accept that, that it completely tells the whole story, right? That there's got to be more to it, or there's got to be some refinement or whatever, and sometimes that's useful, right? So, Eric is an ENTP, so heavy TI user, heavy NE user. And so, he basically dismantled the MBTI and socionics structure and then sort of put it back together in a way that I think works. So I'm not completely against it. It's just, if you're going to do it right, and don't just, be a troll and jump in and tell everybody, okay, you're not an INFJ, you're an ENTP or whatever, without some sort of systemic backing to it, right? So yeah. Anywho, is this pre-party? How wild will the real party be? Well, the real party is going to be pretty wild, I gotta say. You get INFJ and ISTJ together. Watch out. We're going to do some long-term planning. 2 J's in a room, but we'll see. Okay, well, thanks everybody for stopping by. I am going to take a break and hopefully see everybody tomorrow. Take care.